So I want to turn our attention to soccer, as I mentioned at the top of the show. Yes. Brad has never heard those words come out of my mouth before, but something went down at the World Cup over the weekend that was really interesting and got my attention because I have been following the Iranian protests for women's rights very closely. I've written about it a lot at Based. If you haven't read up, I encourage you to do so. So on Monday, the Iranian men's soccer team was playing England in a match at the World Cup, which is being held in Qatar. And the stadium started playing the country's national anthem. And when they did so, a protest broke out both in the stadium and on the field. The men's soccer team actually refused to sing the anthem in tandem. This was caught on video, and at the same time you saw a lot of attendees in the stadium, which include women, and that's interesting because women are banned from going to these kinds of events in Iran, but a lot of them have traveled to Qatar, I believe you call it Qatar actually, to attend this event, and you saw a lot of people in stands booing the song. They were holding signs of protest against their country, some that read things like women, life, freedom. Others had reportedly tried to get into the game wearing the Persian flag instead of the Iranian flag, and because Qatar is also a very oppressive country, and I think in cahoots with Iran, they didn't let them in, but still, I thought that was great. And so it was actually this really public stand in favor of the protests in Iran. And this is, it's a big deal because I think, it's on this world stage. A lot of people have not been following what's happening there as closely as I have been. And in doing so, these people are taking great personal risks because they still have to live in this country. And this is a brutal, inhumane, awful, awful government. So I was very overwhelmed seeing this on Twitter. I literally spent most of yesterday morning crying over this because it was just so powerful. And there's always something for me about seeing people rise up and form movements together to overthrow injustice that is just so powerful. I love seeing these men, these Muslim men, right, who are standing up for women's rights and standing up against what's happening in their country. And I do want to note a few things. So one, I love that Yashar Ali, who's a journalist here in the States, he responded to some of these videos of protests at the stadium. He said, it's not our national anthem. It's the national anthem of the Islamic Republic, which is an occupying force in Iran. And so oftentimes in our country, I feel like when we talk about Iran or Iraq or Saudi Arabia, there's this urge to conflate the people who live in these states with the governments and to say that they're, supportive of their governments. They asked for this. They want this. That is absolutely not the case. These are really oppressive regimes that are very difficult to overturn. And again, the people have been disarmed. But I think it's really important that we learn to do that, right? Start separating the people of these countries from their governments. And this, I think, really was something that helped a lot of Americans hopefully do that. I also want to note that this did seem to be a pre-planned protest as far as the actual soccer players go. The team's captain, and I really hope I don't butcher his name, but I think it's Hassan Hashafi, gave a statement before the game offering condolences to the victims of the protest. And he said, "We are with them and sympathize with them. We are here, but it does not mean that we should not be their voice or we must not respect them. Whatever we have is from them. We have to fight. We have to perform the best we can and score goals and present the brave people of Iran with the results. And I hope that the conditions change to the expectations of the people."
Yeah, so maybe for listeners, can you just remind us how this all got started, these protests?
Yes. So these protests have been raging for about 2 months in the country, and they started because the country has what's called the morality police. And these are literally people that stand in the streets and go around and shake down mostly women for not following.
Dystopian. Morality police.
Yes. And, of course, they're kind of under Sharia law there, basically. And so women have to be covered and they have to wear a hijab. And they not only have to wear a hijab, but have to do it exactly right. And so they arrested this young woman 2 months ago for allegedly not wearing her hijab correctly. Her brother was with her, tried to defend her. It was no good. They took her into custody. And shortly thereafter, she ended up dead. And basically her family says, they murdered her. Her skull was beaten. Her body was badly beaten. They tried to say, the government and the police tried to say, oh, she died from an underlying cause. No, they murdered her. And apparently this is not an outlier. These things have been happening in the country, and people just, finally had enough and started rising up. And so a women-led protest movement first broke out where women were taking off their hijab and going into the street and saying, absolutely not, no more. And it caught fire. And they've now been joined by men, and they're joined by all age demographics. But the dominant force leading the protests, as you often see in these kinds of revolutions, is the young people. The youth of the country are really coming out in force. And I want to be very clear that what's happening in response to these protests is tragic and horrific, and it's very difficult to watch it go down. They are literally murdering people. They are disappearing people. They are giving them the death penalty for protesting. They're sentencing them to very long, harsh sentences, which, our jails are nothing to joke about, but there's, it's certain torture if you're held in their prisons and jails. And it's, it's these people are protesting and fighting back at great personal cost and risk to themselves, which is why I think I was so moved by the Iranian men and their stance, because they have to worry about their families back home who could be retaliated against for that. They have to worry about their own safety. There have been some other celebrities and sports figures who have sort of like nodded towards the protests and shown support, but this was the most like visible, dominant sign of that. And it was on such a world stage that obviously it's going to be very embarrassing to the Iranian government. So, I don't know what will happen. I'm praying for their safety, but like you can't underestimate what that show of support meant.
Yeah, I really loved it because in a time of so much virtue signaling, they demonstrated actual virtue with this because they are actually sacrificing something to make a statement. They're putting their families or themselves at jeopardy. I hope they might well be fine, but it's like they're actually doing something brave and bold and risking something to stand up for what's right. Whereas, to give you an alternative example, the England team was planning on having the captain wear a rainbow armband. However, they were told to stand up for LGBT rights, which are viciously oppressed in the host nation, Qatar or Qatar. The pronunciations vary. And they were told that if that's not allowed, and if the captains do, they will receive a yellow card, which would be not great. A yellow card is a warning, and if you get another yellow card over the course of the game, you're then red carded, and your team has to play down a man. So it would be, especially considering, and this maybe is a little too soccery for people, but the England captain is, I believe, Harry Kane, their forward. So if he got a yellow card for making this protest, it wouldn't be too difficult for him to play a whole game on a yellow card. A defender, it would be very hard to play with a yellow card because if you make one bad foul, you'd be out. But for an offensive player, he probably could have done it, but it was like a modest sacrifice to their competition, like pretty minor, that they would have had to endure. And they're like, okay, guess we can't do it then. And so they didn't do it. Meanwhile, these Iranian players are literally out here risking it all to stand up for freedom. That to me is virtue, not virtue. I do constantly chastise people for virtue signaling, but in this case, they're virtue signaling in the good sense. It's not virtue signaling because virtue signaling suggests an emptiness or like a lack of actual action or meaning. They're actually just demonstrating bravery and virtue, and good for them. Bravo, but I do hope it doesn't end up with some dark results for them or their families.
Yeah, I'm definitely cheering on the Iranian men's soccer team now, and I'll be watching the World Cup as I figure out how to. And I don't know, but I do want to bring up one more point here, which is that in response to what's happening in Iran, I have seen many of the usual figures suggesting that the U.S. should be doing more. And it's hard for me because I get very emotional watching these things go down. Like, my heart really breaks for these people. I am so moved by injustice, and so I have such an urge in me to fight it that, like, it is very hard to watch this happening in a country and not want to do something. But my principles and my my knowledge of history both suggest that we absolutely should not get involved in any shape, form, or fashion as a government, as a country, and that in doing so, I'm not hopeful that you would see any better results, right? We've often removed brutal dictators only to have even worse forces spring up in countries. And I think, honestly, what it takes to overturn oppression and injustice long term is the people actually rising up and securing it for themselves. I've seen no proof that any other mechanism of getting to that end goal is actually sustainable, because when the people don't rise up and fight for it and secure it themselves, they cannot sustain it after we leave, right? Which is what you've seen in Afghanistan. And so it's hard to watch, but I do not agree that we should get involved. I'm curious about your thoughts on that. But I will say, I do think for people, especially people who might become, political targets, especially, I would hope to see a very open refugee process in the U.S. for them to get out of there.
Yeah, I think it depends what we mean by get involved, because in terms of military, regime change, well, most of the nations that we've done that in end up far worse than they were to begin with. And also the U.S. has a habit of installing new regimes that are as bad or worse than the old regimes. I think that would be a disaster, and also ultimately American policy should serve America's interests, not the world. We can't police the world. But I do think that we should open our doors to refugees from Iran. I think we can speak boldly on the side of freedom. We can laud the protesters. I even actually do believe, I think broad-based economic sanctions are bad. They hurt the citizens and the economy. But I think like sanctioning individual members of the Iranian regime and the government, freezing their U.S. assets, specific sanctions targeting individuals who've committed atrocities can be appropriate. And I don't think they have the same consequences as would, just sanctioning all Iranian goods, because that would ultimately starve the people,
right,
which is not helping anything. But yeah, I've always thought with the Russian oligarchs, if we freeze their U.S. assets, some of these individuals, I'm not going to cry any tears for them. They pal around with Putin. They deserve it. Why not? So I think there's some things we can do, but I definitely agree that and it's funny, there's some Iranian American friends in the liberty movement who I think they would support some intervention on this one because, and I get it. It's their people. It's their home. But I still, no, I think it would work out worse even for the Iranian people, especially because in that region of the world, there's so much anti-American sentiment that whatever regime you ended up propping up would be really unstable because it would be viewed as America's puppet regime. And I don't know. That's a whole debate, but I'm certainly not somebody who thinks we need to go down that path.
Yeah, I've seen that urge in a few different instances within the kind of liberty movement. Like people who came from Cuba or their families are from Cuba would often support a little bit more intervention there. And I get it because, I'm not Iranian, but I feel compelled to I'm what can I do? Can I house a woman in my house? What can I do? And you just feel helpless. And that's the problem, that a lot of times when people feel they see evil in the world, they feel helpless, they turn to government. And I get the instinct, I get the urge, but it never goes well. It never ends up solving the problem. It just creates 10 more. So unfortunately, I think we have to find ways to donate. I like some of the suggestions you laid out here as far as, seizing assets or freezing their accounts. But sanctions are not a good idea, and we definitely don't need to be getting militarily involved at all.